Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator for the next session, Tom Nuttall.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel on the Eurozone's fiscal framework, fiscal rules, a topic that I hope will prove to be a lot more exciting than it sounds. I'm Tom Nuttall. I write the Charlemagne column for The Economist, and I'm joined by three distinguished panelists. First of all, we have Michael Noonan, who has been the Finance Minister of Ireland since March 2011, and he came to office having to implement a Eurozone bailout. 2.5 years later, he took Ireland out of that bailout, and the economy has performed robustly since. To his left is Thomas Wieser, who is the president of the Eurogroup Working Group, which advises the Eurogroup, the forum in which Eurozone finance ministers meet. And for those of us who follow this stuff in Brussels, we know that Thomas is in charge of the forum where the real work is done. And finally, Guntram Wolf, who since 2013 has been the director of Bruegel, the economics think tank in Brussels. He's a regular commentator and advisor to governments and to parliaments. He's also the co-author of a recent paper on where the EU goes after Brexit, which I highly commend to you. It's one of the most interesting reports that we've seen in the current sort of With a Europe mood. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to the online audience watching via the website. As all of the other moderators have done, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions via the website, via the TATRA Summit app for those of you in the hall. You can tweet your questions for those outside of the hall using hashtag GTS16. We only have an hour, so we're going to try to be quite snappy, and I'm going to begin with you, the Minister Noonan. We've heard a lot from Matteo Renzi, the Italian Prime Minister, about the fiscal rules inside the Eurozone and what he considers to be the unintelligent application of them, the lack of flexibility for a country like Italy that needs investment to kickstart growth. From your perspective, does he have a point?
I think he has a point from the Italian point of view, but I tend to see things from the Irish perspective. And in our circumstances, I think we were the only country that had a constitutional referendum to put the fiscal rules in place. Now, that had the effect of the Irish people taking ownership of the rules. And that's very important, and was very important when we were steering through a series of very difficult budgets. So I wouldn't jettison the rules, but there are flaws that I perceive in the application of the rules, so I would like to see some changes, but I wouldn't knock the house down. I think the house is built on fairly sound foundations, but there should be significant adjustments made now in light of the experience we've had over a number of years.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what adjustments you'd like to see? Where are those flaws?
Well, I think the expenditure benchmark is working very well. The public understand it. If you say that's the ceiling for expenditure for a particular budget, you can communicate that very easily. And again, it's a subset of the public taking ownership of the set of rules. You can explain what's happening. And one of the effects in Ireland was that the opposition parties now, and there are three main opposition parties, when they bring out alternative budgets, as they do, for political reasons and for planning reasons, they're all operating now within the fiscal rules. So, you know, that's been a big influence on pulling politics towards the centre, and will make subsequent transitions in government much easier. Where I would like to see the changes, I don't think the structural deficit rule is working very well. I think it's very difficult to calculate it. I think it's a metric that's unobservable when you start working towards it. And quite frankly, the calculations are wrong in respect of certain countries. If you look at Ireland's experience between 2002 and 2006, if we had applied the structural deficit rules at that period, the result would have been that we were totally in accordance with the rules, and everything was being done properly in the country. when retrospectively we can see we were heading for the edge of a cliff. So it's not, apart from the inexactitude in the calculation, it's not a good rule for guiding policy. But there are other rules which are good. I think the rule, as I said, on the expenditure benchmark, I think that the debt rule at 60% is very good. We probably need a stronger rule in Ireland. In the last budget 3 weeks ago, I announced that we would have a domestic rule where we'd take that down to 45% of GDP by 225 or 226, because we have different circumstances. If you look at Australia and New Zealand, their debt GDP rule is in the teens. Now, they're protecting currencies, which we wouldn't be as part of the Eurozone, but it's probably too high for us. So the second point I'm making, apart from changes in the deficit rule, the structural deficit rule, I think there needs to be more flexibility given to sovereign governments when they're acting sensibly. And something I'd be very strong about in Ireland is we've had a period now of 7 years of very low investment in both social and economic infrastructure. And by any macroeconomic test, we should be investing more now. And the rules are inhibiting me from putting the kind of capital programs together that I would like to put together. So I know there is some flexibility around if you're making structural changes or if you're making investments. They availed of that in Italy. The rule didn't seem to apply in the same way in Ireland.
Well, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask Thomas Wiese. We have heard a lot about flexibility, particularly in the course of the last year or two. I think the Commission produced guidelines on how its flexibility provisions could be exploited by governments. But that creates a difficulty, doesn't it? Because under the European semester, every Eurozone government must submit its draft budget at a certain time to the Commission. It will wait for a reply. The more flexible the rules are, the more scope for flexibility, the harder it is to predict how the Commission is going to respond to that budget. And there's a separate but related issue, which is about democratic accountability. A government has been elected by voters, it assembles a budget, but then it becomes answerable also to the European Commission as to how that budget is going to work. How do we resolve those difficulties?
Very good question. We're on our way to possibly resolving it. Mario Draghi again and again makes the distinction between institutions and rules. And in monetary policy, we've got, for the Eurozone, we've got an institution which runs policy. And for fiscal policy, we quite obviously do not have an institution. And if and as long as you do not have an institution, you need common rules that guide everybody's behavior. And that needs to be clear and predictable, and it needs to be able to be communicated not only to national politicians, but also to the public. And we've come quite a long way over the last 1.5 decades in these rules. And we started out with a very simple set of rules which guided our behavior by saying you shall not do more than that or that in nominal deficit terms.
And everybody broke them.
Well, Germany and France started off. And these were rules that the former president of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, called stupid. And for anybody who's studied economics beyond Macro 101, indeed, running fiscal policy with nominal deficits is not very clever. Then came the 2003 French and German affair, or debacle, depending on which side of the Rhine you're on, upstream or downstream. And so we changed to something which was infinitely more clever. If you've progressed beyond Macro 101, we changed to structural values, cyclically adjusted variables. They're extremely clever. They're very good. Nobody's ever seen one. And if you put 5 economists into a room, they'll come up with probably 8 different values for the structurally adjusted deficit or surplus soon of Ireland. So how do you run policy? Why do you actually have it? And so it's fine to be able to say Ireland was running cyclically adjusted deficits of such and such 2 years back. But asking Minister Noonan to make his budget for 2017 on presumed structurally adjusted values is much more difficult, to put it that way. And then the economic situation became more and more choppy and differentiated, and that's when the flexibility that you mentioned came into the picture. So it was even more intelligent, of course. And the flexibility, we've got the flexibility for quite a number of different issues. That's fine. Who judges the flexibility? And therefore it's the Commission, which, when evaluating the draft budgetary plans for next year, says, under such and such rules, we would probably send your budget back or send you a letter which asks you to do more, but however, given our rules on flexibility, it will pass muster. Now, the big problem that we've got there is if you apply rules with exceptions, flexibility, and the like, the discretionary element gets larger and larger. And you move away from a purely rules-based system into a more political system, or politicized system, as the case may be. And this is good for those, they think, in the short run, in whose favor people are coming out, but it reduces the predictability. And it makes it even worse for Minister Noonan. Does he know if the flexibility he may have put into his budget, I do not know, or other countries, does he know if the flexibility that he's factored in will actually pass muster or not? And in former times, the finance minister went to the parliament and said, look, here's the budget for 2004. I'm 99.9% confident that it's okay with European rules. Nowadays, you go to Parliament and say, look, here's the budget, and the Prime Minister and I will spend the next 2 months lobbying for people in Brussels to agree to it. So I think we've come to a highly intelligent, very differentiated system, which makes actual running of fiscal policy very, very challenging for those who are in charge at the national level, but it's also very challenging for those at the European level who should be interpreting and enforcing the rules.
And it was precisely those considerations, presumably, that led Wolfgang Schäuble yesterday to reiterate his suggestion that fiscal oversight be removed from the increasingly political or politicized European Commission and placed in the hands of, well, in his suggestion, the ESM, but presumably there could be other sorts of independent agencies that would treat this as a purely technical exercise. Do you think that's a good idea, and do you think there's any prospect of that happening ever?
As I said, I'm very glad that I'm not in the shoes of the Commission, whoever the Commission may be. Pierre Moscovici was here yesterday. Because the more flexible the system is, the more you are subject to political pressure, and fiscal policy is very much of a one-shot subject. There is no trade-off, there is no compromise, it's just pure political discussions. And therefore, I think it would be in the interest of everybody concerned if we could revert to a system of very clear rules where there is little degree of latitude in judging it. I would think that it would be good if there is a certain amount of flexibility, provided that you are doing the right thing. And the right thing is a combination of, on the one hand, taking account of financial sustainability, fiscal sustainability over the long term, and the other one is taking care of cyclical stabilization. And what people find nowadays, the outside analysts say, on aggregate, we think you're doing more or less the right thing. However, those who should be doing the stabilization are doing too much in terms of sustainability. Those who should be taking great care of sustainability are doing too much stabilization. So on average, we're super. The problem is the distribution around the mean of the average.
Yes, which speaks to the point you began with, the absence of an institution on the fiscal side as opposed to on the monetary side. Günther and Wolf, we all obsess over fiscal numbers and deficits and the Stability and Growth Pact and the Maastricht criteria. Some have suggested, particularly those who fall on the wrong side of that argument, that we do so at the expense of other benchmarks we should be looking at, such as the current account. We hear a lot less about Germany's whopping current account surplus than we do about Italy's budget deficit, for example. Do they have a point? Should we be paying more attention to some of these other imbalances?
Well, I think that's right. We need to pay attention not only to fiscal issues, but of course to all the imbalances that are building up in our economy in other sectors as well. Clearly, what fiscal rules try to achieve is essentially two things. One is fiscal sustainability, and the other one is fiscal stabilization. Now, the problem is, of course, if you have a private sector whose debt at some stage could be socialized. Of course, we have now agreed that there will be bail-in and no bail-out for banks anymore, but that may not be the reality in a future major crisis. So we have a lot of contingent liabilities out there, and those liabilities, those vulnerabilities, need to be taken into account. Because what I really care about, I guess, as a finance minister from a Eurozone country, is that I don't have to bail out another Eurozone country. I mean, that's ultimately what we want to achieve with these rules. And the reality is you can bail out a perfectly sound country because it has imbalances in the private sector. Arguably, Ireland, for example, came into the crisis with a very low debt to GDP ratio. I mean, there were some issues that the tax base was too much focused on the housing market. But okay, I mean, they were running surpluses, so they had low debt to GDP ratios. Still, there was the bailout. So clearly, there is a need to look at these other vulnerabilities. But let me add the one point which I think is important, and where your mentioning of the fiscal authority becomes complicated. Of course, in a monetary union, we would ideally want to coordinate monetary and fiscal policies, especially and I mean basically only when monetary policy is at the zero lower bound. So when monetary policy cannot do much more than it does currently, what you would like to see is sort of some coordination around the major fiscal actors. And as Thomas just described, on average, we probably get it right, but we get it right because of a wrong composition, right? I mean, so we do probably too little in Germany, too much in Italy. I mean, to put it a bit provocatively. And so I guess that's what we would probably have to achieve through some fiscal coordination that is at its heart a political fiscal coordination, because I very much doubt that we will be able to create a capacity at the Eurozone level with own firing power that would be sufficient to do these kind of things.
And I mean, what is the chance of that happening anytime soon? I mean, I think we assume that major changes in the approach to Eurozone-wide fiscal governance are off the table, at least until after all of the elections that we have next year. But there is some fresh thinking going on around the Five Presidents' report. The Commission is working on some ideas that I understand will be inserted into the statement that will get around the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome next March. After these elections are out of the way, what is the scope for a significant step forward on fiscal coordination of the sort that you're talking about?
Well, I'm personally quite pessimistic. I don't think we will move a lot, and the reason is quite simple. I mean, fiscal policy making is at the heart of national sovereignty, and any fiscal policy decision is an intrinsically political decision that is very, very important for citizens and for voters and for politicians. And that's why countries will want to keep and sustain as much sovereignty as they can on their national fiscal policies. And that believes me, and that's also the reason, by the way, why the fiscal rules framework ultimately doesn't really work currently. It doesn't work because countries hate to be told something that they dislike. So I think ultimately what I think is perhaps a more credible vision is to say we become less intrusive on the fiscal rules, and it's a vision, less intrusive on the fiscal rules, less intrusive in terms of national policy making. We'd let national policymakers take the decision, but then we also make sure that they assume the responsibility for these decisions. And that, of course, is another way of saying the no bailout clause has to regain some credibility. So if a country runs unsustainable fiscal policies, there needs to be at least some pain for the private creditors holding that debt.
Okay. We only have just over half an hour left, so I think I may turn to the audience for some questions. I might gather 2 or 3 if we have them. So if you could raise your hands, tell us who you are, keep your questions relatively brief, if you have any. We have one at the front over here, please.
Yes, Vivian Schmidt. Thank you for your remarks. One word I haven't heard is growth. And my big question would be, how can one ensure that following these fiscal rules will ensure growth in these various countries? And just one follow-up on Gutfram Wolf is, I think you're absolutely right about needing to renationalize. How do you coordinate at the EU level at the same time that you renationalize policy?
Thank you. Do we have any more questions at this stage, please, at the back here?
Franz Nauschnig, Austrian Central Bank. My question is balance between fiscal and monetary policy. We have a very expansionary monetary policy in the euro area, but fiscal policy is not helping, not really helping. So shouldn't we have a more expansionary fiscal policy at the current level? Because now at the zero lower bound, fiscal multipliers are so big that they become self-financing.
Thank you. And I think the woman here. Yep.
Stephanie Bolson, UK correspondent for Die Welt. My question goes to Minister Noonan. Next, I think Wednesday, you have a meeting in Dublin on Brexit, a very special summit on Brexit. And some people say that Ireland might be more hit by Brexit than the UK itself. Do you think that's exaggerated, or there's some truth in it?
Quite a lot to do with fiscal rules.
Question.
Thank you very much. Minister, there was a question directed at you. Would you like to take it? Not
Well,
necessarily on fiscal rules.
I don't think Ireland will be more hit by Brexit than the UK itself. And I don't think that's the argument that's being put forward. But I think of the countries other than the UK, Ireland is more exposed than other European countries, for example. We do about 1.2 billion of trade every week across the Irish Sea, and it supports 400,000 jobs, evenly divided between the 2 jurisdictions. But then we have the specific problem of Northern Ireland, and we don't want the only land border that the UK would have with the European Union to be 40 kilometres north of Dublin Airport. So we have a particular problem on the island of Ireland, and it's further complicated by the voting pattern in the referendum, because while everybody is aware that Scotland voted to stay in Europe, Northern Ireland also voted to stay in Europe, which would mean that quite a significant proportion of the community who traditionally see union with the United Kingdom as their preferred constitutional arrangement on this occasion voted to stay in Europe. So it's quite complicated. We have very good relationships with the UK. Those relationships have certainly survived the change of government, and left to ourselves, we'd sort it out. But of course the negotiation won't be bilateral. The negotiation will be by the European Union on behalf of Ireland and the UK, even when it comes to policies like the border, our proposed border in Ireland. So yes, it's quite complicated for us on a number of fronts, but I think before it finishes, it's going to be complicated for everybody. If I could make a political observation, I don't think the new government in the United Kingdom have a very clear view of what their destination might be, and I don't think the European Commission And Michel Barnier, working with Commissioner Juncker, have a very clear view of where the European Union destination or the preferred destination might be either. So it's difficult at present.
Minister, I just wanted to follow up on something that you said there, and I apologize for getting off the point here, but it's journalist instinct. You said that left alone, the bilateral relationship would be strong enough to ensure that you could arrive at a satisfactory solution around the border and any other issues. Can we infer from that that you have concerns that negotiation position that is ultimately adopted by the Commission with guidelines from the Council may not in every respect sit where Ireland might like it to sit?
No, I think we've had discussions with lots of different people. Michel Barnier was in Dublin recently, and he's going to take the advice of the Irish government on how to resolve these issues. So we don't see a difficulty there. But I'm simply making the point that there's a very strong relationship between the UK authorities and the Irish authorities, and on a bilateral arrangement, we'd fix it fairly quickly. But because it's now going to be part of a much wider negotiation with, from the European perspective, more significant issues at play, we'll be only part of a wider negotiation. But I think it'll be resolved, yes. Okay. I'd like to make the distinction, of course, as well. It would be easier to solve the common travel area and the common labour market, which Ireland and the UK have had for hundreds of years, if only a departure from the European Union is the issue. If a departure from the customs union is also an issue, and if that becomes an issue, well, then the issue of hard borders across the island of Ireland becomes a more difficult issue to resolve.
Absolutely. I think Guntram, he wanted to...
Perhaps just on the Brexit, let me add, I cannot resist either. So
And we do have a panel tonight on Brexit as well.
yeah, but let me just add the one point. I mean, of course, the negotiations around Article 50 are with majority decision making, but the future relation between the EU and the United Kingdom, if it is a meaningful relation that goes beyond a pure goods trade agreement, is probably going to be governed by unanimity. So it's like a mixed agreement CETA.
Yep.
So in other words, every of the 27 countries has a veto right as regards the future relation, which will make this negotiation a very, very complicated negotiation. So it's not the exit negotiation, but the negotiation about the future relation.
Yes. So
But
get ready for more trouble from the Walloons, is what you're saying.
For example, but there may be others who have an open bill to settle with the United Kingdom. I don't know. So let me just answer perhaps on the fiscal rules, because that was sort of one question was on nobody mentioned growth. I think we did. I think a good fiscal framework should take care of stabilization and sustainability, right? I mean, so we want stabilization so that growth doesn't suffer, and we want sustainability so that countries do not get priced out of markets. I mean, that's the real two aims of a good fiscal framework. And I think on the stabilization, what Thomas has been explaining is that these nominal rules have been pretty stupid, and now we have more intelligent rules, but we cannot really measure the things properly, so they are still sort of stupid. So that's a bit, I guess, a provocative way of summarizing it. And so there I would just echo what Minister Noonan said. I do think that there is some advantage in expenditure rules, and I also do think that we should use more proactively and probably reinstate something like a golden rule, so allow investment to be funded by deficits. So real investment, if it is, I mean, properly measured, I think makes sense to fund that with deficits, especially if our interest rates are basically at in negative territory or close to zero. On the monetary fiscal, I think I mentioned it. I think at the zero lower bound, the case for fiscal policy becomes stronger. Now, then, does it mean that everybody should just sort of raise deficits? I don't think so, and I think especially countries that have already a lot of debt and are pretty vulnerable, and anyway have to do an adjustment relative to the rest of the Eurozone, and there the case is not very strong. I think that where you need then the expansion is in the countries that have to do an adjustment in the other direction, and that have to grow a bit more quickly, grow that internal demand a bit more quickly. And so that's I think the problem of coordinating fiscal policies at the zero lower bound. And I think, if I'm honest, I think we will be having a very, very hard time to ever achieve a proper coordination that makes sense from an economic point of view, just because the politics is so diverse. We have 19 different players.
Minister, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, simply on the growth question, in 2015 we grew at just over 6%, and this year we're growing at about between 4.5 and 5 is where it will come in at year end. And our sustainable level of growth is about 3.5 out to the end of the forecasting period. They're all net figures. Now, while we did a lot of restructuring of different sectors of the economy and we became far more competitive, we wouldn't have got anywhere near those growth levels if we hadn't applied the fiscal rules rigorously and got the deficit down, and now are facing into a balanced budget and got the debt GDP ratios down. So we would regard the application of the fiscal rules as absolutely fundamental to growth in our circumstances.
Thomas, I mean, I don't know if you have an answer to either of the questions that we had, but Guntram put something that you said back to you in a rather provocative fashion. I think what he was saying was that we may have replaced one sort of stupidity with another sort of stupidity. Is that a characterization that you would share?
I wagged my finger at him. No, I think I've got not much to add to what I said before. We replaced a system which was easy to run, observable variables, and largely devoid of economic sense if you have significant variations in nominal growth rates. And we replaced it with a system which was good economics, but good economics never foresaw a structurally adjusted budget to be, or figures for that, to be used, or forecast for these figures to be used in putting together not only a budget in next year, but to give excessive deficit recommendations for 2 or 3 years out. And if anybody turns up to me and says, I'm able to calculate your structurally adjusted deficit for 2017, 18, and 19, I might feel obliged to hit the person over the head with some kind of general equilibrium model. So, Guntram is right and not right. It makes economic sense, but we shouldn't really be using it for what we're using it. So we've got now something in addition, which is an expenditure benchmark, and I think that's a pretty solid way of looking at your budget. You say, given your fiscal position, given your debt level, given the state of the economy, your expenditures should be rising or not over the next year by X percent or over the next 2 or 3 years. And that is something which is under the direct control of the individual finance minister, and therefore you can communicate it politically, and the finance minister doesn't run into grief within his or her government and vis-a-vis the Commission. Maybe one more word on what was said about growth. I've been working with and in and around fiscal policy for the past 30 years, and I've hardly ever met anybody who hasn't come to me and said, well, we'll do the fiscally responsible thing as soon as the economic situation is right, as soon as we've got absolutely full employment and everything is hunky-dory. And from time to time, I go back to these people, and it's never right. So we have in Europe a very asymmetric Keynesian slant. We're highly, on average, we're very Keynesian in the downswings, but very anti-Keynesian in the upswing. And that has landed us in the situation we're in.
Asymmetric Keynesianism, if you don't take anything else away from this session, then you have that, at least. More questions? Here in the middle, please.
Ivan Kun, Konzervatívny institút Slovakia. I'm a political scientist, not economist, therefore maybe my question will be a little bit naive. But Eurozone is for few years try to solve problem of European Monetary Union. What during those years were doing Denmark and Sweden? It seems to me that they don't have to solve any problems. Maybe it's only my economic ignorance, but do they have solved some problems?
Okay, and I think we had someone in the back here.
Panos Tsakloglu, Athens University of Economics and Business. Can we move, let's say, beyond the immediate next steps? The monetary union was supposed to be the jewel of the crown of the European integration, but we are in a grave danger that it will be the graveyard of European integration. If we look at history, there are many monetary unions. The only ones that were successful, at least the ones that come to my mind, are the ones who were transformed into fiscal unions as well. During the crisis, we took several steps in this direction. However, real common fiscal policy does not exist. Common fiscal policy, of course, requires budget. Budget requires some kind of a state entity. State entity means federalism, and this is the anathema for the electorate part of large parts of the population in several countries. What's the way ahead then?
Thank you. And then Stefan here.
Thank you very much. Stefan Lehne from Carnegie Europe. The finance ministers yesterday were quite clear is that the economic and monetary union is not really sustainable at the moment. There's still more economic divergence than convergence. And they very much stressed the need for more reforms. At the same time, they were absolutely clear that treaty reform is out of the question. Now, I had the impression in the very significant reforms that took place after the big crisis, the treaty was already stretched and bent as much as possible. The question to the panel is there a lot of scope for additional reform within the existing treaty structure? Or will the moment come where we'll simply have to move beyond that?
Thank you. And we also have a question that has been sent to us via the TATRA Summit app. And it's on the screen above you. It's a question about Greece, which we haven't mentioned yet. Now, Greece has obviously been operating within slightly different strictures under its various bailout programs. The question we have here is, will structural deficits help improve the Greek economy without debt relief? And I suppose there's a supplementary question to that, which is that, is it realistic to expect Greece to move towards a primary surplus of, I think it's, Thomas will tell us if I'm wrong, 3.5% of GDP if we want to lift this economy out of recession. So 4 questions there. Who wants to go first? Don't all jump. Guntram.
Okay, I can talk for ages about each of the questions, so it's great to have them all. I think on Greece, let me just say, I think the idea to drive up a primary surplus to 3.5% and sustain it there for 10, 15, or Thomas knows the exact number of years, I think is not going to work, and it's bad for the Greek economy. And so I think we will need lower primary surplus targets. As regards sort of the longer term question, I think basically it's a question that is not answered, right? I mean, so the political system has not answered the question whether we will go ahead with further integration steps or not. I mean, that question has not been answered, and that question will have to be answered at some stage. I think before we will be able to go in that direction, the issue of economic convergence, and someone mentioned it here, I think will have to be addressed. I mean, in a union in which we still have a labor cost divergence of 20 to 30%, unemployment rates that are twice as high in the south than in the north, economic productivity growth of 0 for the last 20 years in an important country in the south. I mean, as long as we have these kind of conditions, I think the politics will not be ready to move much further. And then it will be a sort of managing issues that come up on the run. And I guess Well, and then there is the legal question. So what does all of this mean legally? And I think the EU treaty. I mean, it's you can do a lot of things with side treaties. Yeah, I mean, the ESM is sort of done. I mean, okay, there was a change in the EU treaty, but the ESM treaty is outside of the EU treaty, right? And could you develop the ESM treaty further? Yes, I think you could. You wouldn't have to touch the EU treaty. You would have to touch the ESM treaty. I mean, and you could move some things there. And I would start with moving quite a bit on the banking union side, and make sure that we complete the banking union, and have not only address the NPL problem, address the actual problems, but also then create the institutions like EDIS, like the unemployment insurance, but also the fiscal backstop. And that relates very much to the ESM treaty and not so much to the EU treaty.
Minister.
Yeah, I think that there's a kind of a common thread to all the questions, and it's a kind of a thread of disappointment that Europe isn't making greater progress. But you get a better perspective on Europe if you look back rather than look forward. Europe is more like a raft than a speedboat. And rafts are very hard to sink. They stay afloat, they keep going. But if you look back and you look at the political progress in Europe until we've got to this amazing construct of 550 million people across Europe. I remember when there was dictatorships in Portugal and Spain. Now they're all part of democratic Europe with great respect for human rights. It's not so long since the Russian Empire was pretty strong in Bratislava and places further east. And look what has happened. And if you look back and see the progress, it's an amazing structure. It's unprecedented in the world. And even if you look back at the last 3 or 4 or 5 years when the whole world was hit by the greatest recession since 1929, look at the progress that Europe has made. It's growing again, not as fast as we would like, but it has started to grow quite significantly. There's a very strong monetary policy. There's a banking union on the cusp of being completed. Programme countries like Ireland, Spain and Portugal are back with full sovereignty again and growing strongly, and Greece is making progress. So you get a better perspective if you look back. And again, if you take the kind of metaphor of the raft, you think it's going nowhere. But our discussion today is again exploring ways forward to make more progress in the key areas. And obviously, Brexit is giving Europe a fairly hard hit, but I would hope we'll have the skill to negotiate a new relationship with the United Kingdom that won't harm the fundamental positions of the European Union. Now, I'd like if progress was faster. I'd be very strongly pro-European since my earliest days in politics, and I'd be an advocate of further European integration. I mean, we're doing things in the last 5 or 6 years that Alexander Hamilton was doing in the United States around 1790, 1800. And if you look at the United States as your model, you can see that it's a transfer union, and it's a union where there was mutualization of debt, for example, from the very, very start. Now, a lot of people in Europe wouldn't like that as a model, but there is a model in existence of how, a number of states with disparate objectives and disparate backgrounds can come closer together and have the kind of monetary union which the United States has. So I'd be optimistic. I know we have problems with migration. I know we have problems with security. I know we have problems with, the terrorism, exchange of information. But if you look at the fundamental economics of Europe at present, it's out of the recession. It's beginning to grow. There's a coherence of purpose. So I'd be quite optimistic about it. That's not to say that the other problems haven't to be addressed. Of course they have to be addressed. And, I think after Brexit, I remember the debates on Brexit in Brussels when it looked as if the result would be different. And there was a kind of a B plan in people's heads that the solution for Brexit was more Europe. Well, I'd be a great believer in more Europe, but at present it's not the solution for anything. What we have to do is systematically solve the individual threats to Europe, which we all know about, and we have to bring forward solutions to all these problems, and then work on again. But it's not a long time since Ireland joined in 1973. And it's more recent when countries like Slovakia joined, and it's in the middle distance when Spain and Portugal and Greece joined. So it's you know, we're only a teenager in terms of the historic perspective, but we're quite strong, and I think we can solve our problems and move forward.
Right now, an extremely moody teenager. Thomas, is the Hamiltonian model the one that you think is appropriate for the Eurozone? I think you're half American, aren't you?
I used to be. So, if you look at the American setup, you've got a fairly large federal budget. You've got, with a few provisos, states cannot run deficits, and individual towns like Detroit can go bust. So anybody who says we are simply going to transfer a federal model, be it the United States or Switzerland or Germany, and transfer that as transfer union, intellectual transfer union, transfer that to monetary union or to the European Union, is of course totally wrong. Because it would imply that we have a very large federal budget with a federal government sitting in Brussels and watching the rain, and the individual member states would not be allowed to run a deficit any longer, and the community of Namur could go bust. So this is not going to happen. So we've got to create, in a sort of post-Hamiltonian world, something different. And because we will not, and it's useless to speculate what will be the case in 50, 60 years, what are we going to have in 5 years or 10 years? And Guntram has mentioned it, and I very much agree with him, is there's a case to be made for individual member states simply taking the responsibility and have problems of sovereign debt restructuring if their fiscal policy has been too loose. This is, of course, a can of worms because it has implications not only for fiscal stability, but also for financial stability. So if you talk about that, you have to have a very stable banking union where there is a large degree of disassociation of bank balance sheets from the public balance sheet, but the public balance sheet from the bank balance sheets as well. But in the meantime, and we still have to live in the meantime until we get there, there are quite a number of things which could be done better. And they also hang together with what is happening in the monetary policy field nowadays. And I think what the central bankers are telling us is that we've done the heavy lifting, but you haven't done any lifting. So some people would argue now's the time to get going, but you could also say, well, maybe monetary policy has simply made the life of politicians so easy that they didn't feel the urge to do the reforms that would lift potential output growth. And this it also hangs together with the question of what to do with fiscal policy. People love to look at the deficit or the surplus and what does it do for the cycle, what does it do for the economy, and they tend to forget that composition also matters. And we call it the quality of public budgets. And there is a huge amount you could do with the same fiscal policy by being much more pro-growth than many of the budgets are. And many, I think all ministers, all finance ministers agree when you say you have to increase the quality of public budgets. move away from growth retarding expenditure categories, move towards more growth promoting expenditure categories. Same on the revenue side. But then you say, hold on a second, does that mean pension reform? And you say, it probably means pension reform. They say, oh, well, let's wait a little on this one. So
Okay.
there is lots you can do to lift Europe onto a higher growth potential plane with, I think, a very decent fiscal policy which does wonders for stabilization and sustainability, but it requires very difficult political decisions.
Yes, plus ça change. We have about 5 minutes left. I know there's at least one more question over here. And do we have any more?
I'll start, Tom. Bruno Massais from Carnegie Europe. You talked about a number of problems with the fiscal rules framework, but two problems that I think are more serious than that weren't mentioned. First, this adversarial logic between member states and the Commission. I followed on and off the Portuguese case and Spanish case recently with the sanctions. Our whole political debate in Portugal became about us versus them, us, Portugal versus the Commission. What is the idea behind this adversarial logic? Sometimes it's good to have competition, but this purely adversarial logic is very destructive. I don't understand what we're doing here. Second, the link between economic policy and fiscal policy, which, I mean, the complete absence of link at the European level, to me, is more puzzling than the weak links between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So let's say member states want to invest in the digital transformation of industry, which is a priority for the EU. Why isn't this taken into account when the budgets are being examined? Some countries have 30%, 40%, 60% youth unemployment. Others have 5%, yet the rules are the same for both of them. Some countries want to invest in infrastructure to respond to Chinese initiatives. Why isn't this being taken into account? There's economic policy and fiscal policy, and there's a chasm between them. There are no bridges, no links. This is unheard of from a historical perspective. And when we talk about the flexibility in the fiscal rules, it does mention structural reforms, which is a form of economic policy, but then you look carefully, and it's structural fiscal reforms, pension systems and things of that sort, not structural economic reforms, like, let's say, digital transformation of industry or things of that sort.
Thanks. And then Steve.
Yeah, hi, Stephen Fiddler from the Wall Street Journal. Very quick, Gunther mentioned sort of return of the no bailout rule. What about then a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism? It's never going to happen, is it?
Okay, thanks. And well, I'll go back to the panel and if you answer the questions, but any closing statements as well, because we've only got a few minutes left. Minister, would you like to start?
Well, I think that, you know, economics isn't politics, and accountancy isn't politics either. And from a political perspective, one can know what the best thing might be to do, but you still have to bring your people with you, and you have to ensure the support for implementing policies. Otherwise, it's all theory, and it doesn't have any effect on the lives of the people. So very often, the political route isn't a straight road. And that's why, on occasions, we need flexibility. Now, part of the difficulties that smaller countries have with the Commission on the fiscal rules is the perception that the rules are applied differently to smaller countries than to larger countries. Now, I've never objected in the Eurogroup or at ECOFIN to any flexibility being given to larger countries or smaller countries, because, you know, if they argue the flexibility is required, I don't think I'm the person to second guess them. But what it does is it makes it much more difficult to get a consensus around difficult policies in one's own country. If your opponents in the Parliament can get up and say, country X got flexibility and you can't build 20 new schools for all the children who need new schools because you say the fiscal rules doesn't allow you to invest. So that's where the conflict frequently comes between smaller countries and the Commission, the perception of an uneven application of the rules. Okay. So I think to get over that, I think in the key areas, more flexibility has to be given. And I think there is a way forward on the investment issue, which I'd be strong on, because there's already flexibility built into the rules to say that if you're restructuring a sector of your economy, you can have a more favorable fiscal ruling. And if you're investing to achieve that end, you can have a more favorable fiscal ruling. Now, I tried to do this and I examined it, and the conditions were so tight, it didn't give me room to do the kind of capital investment I required. But I think there's work being done on that at Commission level. And, you know, if genuine flexibility is built in there that applies to all countries, big and small, well, then progress can be made. But it's very hard to explain to people when you have the resources and when the need is obvious, why you can't build schools, health centres, and all the social and economic infrastructure that a country like Ireland now needs.
Okay, Minister.
So we need space to get for that.
Thank you very much. Thomas, and maybe if you could address the question about sovereign debt restructuring as well. In 30 seconds.
I'd simply say there is an intermediate step, namely that you ideally have conditions where the market signals to you through spreads that you are running a policy which is considered risky and which may move you towards losing access to markets. And at this stage, we don't have it for quite a number of reasons. It is because of monetary policy, and it is because of the presumption that, à la limite, there will be an ESM program forthcoming that'll bail you out anyway. And you could argue that there's an interlinkage between not following the fiscal rules and the feeling of equanimity that you have, because so many policy instruments are available that will not let this ultimate risk materialize. So that is the conundrum. How do you let market signals work through in such a manner that there's market discipline on individual fiscal actors? And what Guntram mentioned is, of course, one of the possibilities, and it is one that most sovereigns that are not part of a monetary union face, ultimately.
Okay, thank you. Guntram, last word.
Yeah, perhaps one very quickly on the adversarial logic. I mean, that is wired into the system. So the system has the option of fines, and the result is that you can be driven to that brink, and then there is indeed an adversarial situation, which is the reason, one of the reasons why I think in the long term we should get rid of that system and move towards a system where countries assume their own responsibilities and then also face the consequences. Now, what does it mean, a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism? Well, the question is, what is really a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism? And I guess my main point there would be, we already have some form of such a mechanism in the form of the ESM. The ESM can only provide, according to its statutes, financial assistance if that is judged to be sustainable. Now, then you can fudge it because, you know, that sustainability assessment is difficult to do. And I'm not saying that anybody has done it, but perhaps some have. But in principle, you can enforce countries to first, I don't know, extend maturities and so on before an ESM program is given. But you need, of course, the support of the member states for it. But I think the fact that there will be a political decision is unavoidable. There are some that propose sort of automatic extension of maturity whenever there's an ESM program. I think that will not happen because it's too controversial. But to have a political decision, deliberate political decision, that this situation is totally unsustainable, I think that's a decision that perhaps we could have taken, for example, in Greece much earlier.
Okay.
And that would have saved us 10, 15, 20% of Greek GDP. And that would have given us the 0.5 or 1% less primary surplus that Greece now has to run.
We've got to wrap it up there. I want to thank the panel for taking a flexible approach to the rules and taking the conversation to a fascinating place. Thank you to the audience here and online. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We have 2 night owl sessions at 9 o'clock tonight. One of them, if you haven't had enough of me already, will be on Brexit. The other one is on populism. Buses for the TATRA Summit Gala dinner leave outside the hotel at 6 o'clock in 1 hour. First session tomorrow morning begins at 9 o'clock, but you get an extra hour in bed because the clocks go back. Thank you very much indeed.